Welcome to Astounding Talk Radio with Reggie Stearns. Join us as we explore the how and the why and the forces that shape and mold our world. Talk radio is so astounding, there's no frequency to contain it. Hi, I'm Reggie Stearns, the host of Astounding Talk Radio, and welcome to the show. I'm broadcasting from our studio in Boise, Idaho, and it's a beautiful Indian summer day here. Looking outside the window, I can see the leaves have a hint of amber on them, and I know that autumn is on its way and summer's on its way out, right? Anyway, I think you'll enjoy today's show, From Liberty to Democracy. If you think America was founded as a democracy, you'll probably want to listen to today's show, because contrary to what most think, our founders were fearful of democracy and the tyranny of the majority. As most Americans know, we fought a war of independence with Great Britain to secure our freedoms and independence. However, from the ratification of the Constitution until today, we've morphed from a republic with limited powers and maximum personal liberty into more of a progressive, government-oriented democracy. For most, this perspective may seem different than we were taught in school, and you'd be right. So today's discussion looks into the transformation which our founders tried to avoid. If you like a good story and history with a hint of economics thrown in, you'll love today's show.
Our guest today is Randall G. Holcombe. He's a Devoe Moore Professor of Economics at Florida State University. Dr. Holcombe received his Ph.D. in Economics from Virginia Tech and taught at Texas A&M University and at Auburn University prior to coming to Florida State in 1988. He's a fellow at the James Madison Institute, a Tallahassee-based think tank that specializes in issues facing state governments. He's a past president of the Public Choice Society and Society for the Development of Austrian Economics, and served on Florida Governor Jeb Bush's Council of Economic Advisors from 2000 to 2006. He's the author of 12 books and more than 100 articles published in academic and professional journals. Among the books he's authored are Economic Foundations for Government, From Liberty to Democracy, Constitutional Theory and Constitutional History of Colonial America. Today we're just so happy to have him here. We're going to discuss one of his books, is Liberty to Democracy, The Transition of American Government. Dr. Holcombe, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thanks for inviting me, Reggie. I'm delighted to be talking with you.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I was looking through your book today, and it's amazing where America's come from its founding to where it's going today. America definitely is focused on liberty. And, of course, if you ask any American, they'll say, yes, we're a democracy. But tell us a little bit about From Liberty to Democracy. That sounds strange. Wouldn't most Americans think that we are a democracy?
Yeah, one of the interesting things in thinking about those concepts is the way that there's been a pretty remarkable transformation over the past couple of centuries in the way that Americans think of their government. And if you were to go back to 1776 and just take somebody off the street and say, tell me in one word, what's the fundamental principle underlying our new American government? That word would have been liberty. That the founding fathers had the idea, and the citizens of the time had the idea, that the role of government is to protect people's liberty, to protect individual rights. And in contrast, if you were to grab somebody off the street today and ask them, tell me in one word, what's the fundamental principle of American government? The most common answer that you would get would be democracy. We're a democracy. It's majority rule. The government does what the people want. And so this idea that the government does what people want is majority rule. We're a democracy. That's so different from the idea that the founding fathers had. And in fact, when the Constitution was written to design the structure of our government, it was deliberately designed to limit the influence of popular opinion on the government. It was deliberately designed to limit democracy. And one reason I think it's important to think about the concepts is, today if you are critical of democracy, have some idea, talking critically of democracy, it almost sounds anti-American because we think, well, the United States, we're a democracy. So if you're critical of democracy, it sounds like that's critical of the United States. But if you go back to the country's founding, in fact, we deliberately tried to limit the popular opinion, the influence that popular opinion would have on government policy. And the fundamental principle was liberty, protecting people's rights, not democracy and do what most people want.
That's definitely the enumerated powers in the Constitution really did limit our elected officials to certain powers, certain duties, I guess. Of course, if you ask people today, they'll say we're a democracy, but really aren't we a republic? And how does that factor into people's thinking and where we've come today?
Well, I think the Republican idea, the idea of limited government, representative government, isn't so common. That notion isn't so commonly held as the notion that we're a democracy. It's really interesting if you go back to the early 1990s, after the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, the demise of the Soviet Union in 1991, and so I mean, what won the Cold War for us was the people on the other side of the Iron Curtain said, we want the kind of life that they have, not the kind of life that we have. But what we were promoting to them, what we were telling those people, the former Soviet republics, the Eastern Bloc countries, we were telling them, you need to have democratic government. Democracy is the answer. So I think the concept that we ourselves sell to the rest of the world is the concept of democratic government. It's not the concept of a Republican government, and it's not the concept of a limited government that protects people's liberty.
And what a different world we would have today if that was what we were selling, if we were selling liberty and limited government versus democracy. What do you think going from liberty to democracy affected our place in the world?
Well, that's hard to say. I mean, I think we might have actually had a bigger impact on the rest of the world because as we moved from liberty to democracy, the powers of government grew. And so you look at our influence in the 20th century, World War I, World War II, the Cold War, we've had a lot heavier hand in the world than we might have if the fundamental principle of government was to protect our rights. And even today, I mean, you look at how adventuresome we seem to be across the world, in the Middle East, other places. I'm not sure we would have been so adventurous had we not had the expansion of government that came with that change in ideology.
Right. Let's look back a little bit here. Liberty. When you say liberty versus democracy, what are you talking about?
Well, I'm really talking about the way that people view the role of government. And if you were to go back to the founding of our country and really up until the late 1800s, if you were to ask somebody, what's the role of government? What's the appropriate role of government? People would say it's to protect individual rights. The role of government is to protect people's rights, and so it enables people to get along peacefully with one another. But we had a pretty big change in the view of that ideology toward the end of the 1800s into the 20th century, where that ideology expanded so that people thought not only is the role of government to protect individual rights, but also to look out for their economic well-being. And that was a new idea, and that's the idea of the progressives and the progressive era. Before the progressive era, which started toward the end of the 1800s, sometimes dated from 1900 up until World War I, but before that progressive era, the idea was the role of government is to protect individual rights. And the progressive idea was not only is the role of government to protect our individual rights, but also to look out for our economic well-being.
What in history caused us to go from from what we began to the progressive era is just that people trusted government more, or what was behind that?
Well, I think there are a lot of things behind it, but if you go back to the progressive era, one of the big changes that was occurring in the United States and around the world at that period in time is that you had individuals amassing a substantial amount of economic power. I mean, historians tend to refer to people like Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, Carnegie, those people, as robber barons. But I might dispute calling them that. But the thing is, before, the late 1800s, nobody could really amass a fortune during their lifetimes. And so the people who tended to be the economic elite were people whose fortunes had been built up over decades and centuries, and a lot of times because of political power. But then, because of the Industrial Revolution, you had people at the end of the 1800s who were able to amass a huge amount of wealth during their lifetimes. And that shifted the balance of economic power. And so you had people who didn't have so much economic power thinking that the new economic elite, that those people were taking advantage of them, that the government needed to do something to control the economic power of these people who had amassed such substantial amounts of economic power during their lifetime. And it is, I mean, you look back in history, and it's only at that point in history, to around the late 1800s, somebody could have amassed so much economic power in one lifetime.
That actually goes to the success of America in our form of government. You know, if you're talking about Carnegie and a few others, I know people don't, they like to badmouth Rockefeller and a few others. If you look at, well, for example, Carnegie, when he passed away, he left his endowment with libraries, and he gave basically everything away. Just because you're rich or powerful doesn't necessarily make you a bad person, make you mean. But do you think envy plays a role in it? I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on in our first 100 years of America. You know, we had the Civil War, we had people amassing money, we had people actually having a say in their government, and then you had really the writings, probably the earlier writings, which led to Karl Marx and the future. I think some of those, from my mind, probably played some role in that. But I know you mentioned earlier the Civil War. I know I'm kind of going a different direction here, but you mentioned earlier the Civil War. How did that play a role? Well,
when the nation was founded, the federal government was designed as a federation of states. So the idea, if we look at political power, is the states stood at the top of that pyramid. They controlled the federal government. The states essentially had unlimited powers. They wrote their own powers. But the federal government, if you look at the Constitution, it was a government of enumerated powers. So the federal government had limited powers that were enumerated in the Constitution, and the 10th Amendment to the Constitution says that the powers that aren't specifically given to the federal government are reserved to the states and to the people. So before the war between the states, the idea that people would have had is that the states stand on top of the federal government, but the war demonstrated once and for all that it's actually the federal government that sits on top. And it's interesting if you look at the Constitution. Now, the war was fought because the southern states wanted to secede from the Union. And of course, I mean, we certainly would not deny that slavery was a big issue in that. But let's just think about the issue of secession, which is interesting to think about today. I guess this podcast will air later, so we'll know how the Scottish vote turns out. But and we don't know as we're recording the podcast. But let's think about the issue of secession in the United States, because the Confederate States thought that they had the right to secede. They were trying to secede. But I wonder if you look at the Constitution, I mean, let's look at it and say, did the Confederate States have the right to secede? And it looks to me, as I read the Constitution, that they did. That the Constitution really only mentions the possibility of leaving the Union in one place. And that is right at the end, where before the signatures, the Constitution says that it will take effect when it's approved by 9 of the 13 states. So that would mean that 4 states could not sign the Constitution, and they would be out of the United States. So at that point in history, if 9 states agreed to the new Constitution, 4 states didn't, those 4 states would then not be a part of the United States anymore. They would have seceded from the Union. And there's no other place in the Constitution that addresses secession, but the 10th Amendment does say that the power is not explicitly given to the federal government or reserved to the states or to the people. And so it would seem that secession would be one of those powers. It's not enumerated in the Constitution. Secession would be one of those powers that's reserved to the states. So I don't think it's an extreme reading of the Constitution to say that, looking at the words of the document, the southern states had the right to secede. But we fought a big war over it, and the southern states, well, it turned out that the might of the military power of the North won out, and that right of secession was lost. But so that's a bit of a digression into the Constitution and the role of the war. But ultimately, what that meant was, before the war between the states, there was every reason to think of the states as sitting on top of the federal government with regard to their powers. But after the war between the states, it's clear that the federal government sat above the states. And just another interesting little bit of trivia to go along with that. Before the war between the states, the United States was typically used as a plural term. So you'd say the United States are going to do this, the United States are going to do that, as a plural term. Whereas after the war between the states, now it's a singular term. The United States is the greatest country in the world. So we went from thinking of the United States as a group of states to, after the war between the states, thinking about the United States as a single nation with the federal government sitting on top of the states. And I refer to the war between the states rather than the Civil War, because it really wasn't a civil war. A civil war would take place when one group is trying to take control over the government fighting another group. But the southern states weren't trying to take control of the government. They were fighting for their independence. So just like we talk about our War of Independence in 1776, if the southern states had won, that would have been their War of Independence. Well, it didn't work out that way. But it wasn't a civil war where the Southerners were trying to take over the United States. They were fighting for their independence.
Right. And if you look at the Declaration of Independence, it seems to me that would give them the right for people, their inalienable right, if they weren't getting the liberty they wanted, to secede, just as we seceded from Great Britain. One other thing in there too, I always wondered too, the South, I believe, fired the first shot. So if they would have tried to secede without violence, if they just declared it, elected, their own president, maybe their own Congress, and seen what happened. But once a shot was fired, then it seemed like it was an all-out war. So.
Yeah, now, I'm not a historian. My conjecture is, if the South wanted to secede, that there would be no way to avoid a war. But that might be a better question for a historian to look at.
It's definitely a fascinating topic. But, America did change from the Civil War going forward, because we went from these United States to the United States, and with the federal government being on top, and then the states now being really subordinate to them, which I'm guessing led to the progressive era somehow, and going from liberty to democracy.
Well, I think that's right. And another thing that happened after the war between the states was that the veterans interest groups became very powerful in the United States. Now, after the war, there was in 1865, there was a bill passed through Congress to provide pensions for veterans who were injured in the war. And of course that only applied to Union veterans, not Confederate veterans. But the pension bill said that if a veteran was injured in the war, that those injured veterans had a right to collect a pension. So it wasn't for all veterans, it was just for injured veterans. They had the right to collect a pension as long as they were disabled from their injury, and they had up to 5 years to claim their pension. So you would think, since the war was over in 1865, by 1870, all the pensions that would have been claimed would have already been claimed. But what happened was that the pensions got increasingly generous, and people would hire pension attorneys. There were attorneys in Washington, D.C. who specialized in getting individuals' pensions. So people would hire attorneys. They would get special bills passed through Congress to get their pensions, and the veterans' pensions became increasingly generous. Eventually, Congress passed an Arrears Act that said if you were newly qualified for a pension, that you would collect that pension not only starting from this day forward, but you would collect the pension in arrears all the way back to the end of the war. And so if you got a veteran's pension, the arrears would amount to more than the average annual income of an American. So there's really a bonanza to be had if you got that veteran's pension. The city's pensions became increasingly generous, and eventually Congress decided that looking at you had to be disabled. Congress said anybody who's over 65, that would automatically qualify as a disability. So any Union veterans who were over 65, then they qualified for a pension. Now, what was going on there was, you go back to 1865, and it's easy to see, hey, these veterans injured in war, they deserve our support. They were fighting for us. They were disabled in war, so we ought to support them. But increasingly, as the decades went on, the pensions became increasingly generous, and it shifted from payments to deserving disabled veterans to essentially a special interest scheme where the federal government was transferring a huge amount of money to veterans. And so these veterans interest groups, the biggest one was the Grand Army of the Republic. But the Grand Army of the Republic wasn't actually an army, it was a special interest group that supported veterans. And that is really the first case in American history of a major interest group that put a big raid on the Treasury. There were interest groups from the beginning of the country. But the Grand Army of the Republic and those, the Union veterans, that was the first case where an interest group really was able to raid the Treasury and get a substantial amount of monetary transfers from the federal government to that group. And, these days, sometimes we think of the Democratic Party as being almost an arm of big labor and the labor unions. There's that association between labor unions and the Democratic Party. But if you go back to the late 1800s after the war between the states, the connection between the veterans and the Republican Party was much stronger. That essentially the Republican Party supported the veterans supported the Republican Party, and that kept the Republican Party in the White House pretty much up until the Great Depression. I mean, it's interesting when you look at American presidents. Abraham Lincoln was the first Republican president, elected in 1860. And from Lincoln, elected in 1860, to Franklin Roosevelt, elected in 1932, we only had 2 Democratic presidents during that time. So the Republicans just dominated the White House. We had Grover Cleveland who was elected 1880s, 1890s, and then we had Woodrow Wilson, the only two Democratic presidents elected from 1860 to 1932. And why? Was because the Republican Party was the party of the North, which had more population than the South, and the Republican Party supported the veterans supported the Republican Party, and they were able to dominate the White House as a result. So it's kind of an interesting historical progression there.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It appears that nothing has changed. Today, it's the unions in the Democratic Party, and I don't know who the Republican special interest would be, but some people would say the wealthy. But if you really look at the Republican Party, they may have some wealth in it, but the Democratic Party is probably just as wealthy. And then you look at the history of the Republican Party. I mean, Lincoln was a Republican. The Civil Rights Act of the 64 and that era was sponsored by the Republicans. So then it's kind of funny how the special interests always seem to move in Washington. Alex de Tocqueville said, if you recall that gentleman, he came to America. I think he was a Frenchman, came to America and wrote. I forgot even I think it's Democracy in America.
Democracy in America.
That as soon as Americans found out that they can vote representatives in that would let them dip into the treasury, that our democracy, the republic, might be threatened. So we'll soon find out, I guess, in the years to come. But it's funny how we went from really kind of a hands-off government. Now we're into the Civil War era, where now the first special interest group really comes on scene, and it's the veterans from the Civil War. And then from there we move from the Civil War into the Progressive era. Oh, before I go any further, in the pre-show we talked about, you're primarily an economics professor. What brought an economics professor to consider democracy and liberty?
Well, this project really started because I was very interested in looking at the growth of government spending in the 20th century. And if you look at the historical facts on that, in the 20th century, in just about every country around the world, you've had a huge expansion in government expenditures as a share of income. In the United States, you go back to say 1913, and I'm not picking that year at random. That's the year the income tax amendment was passed, so we started the federal income tax. But the United States, the federal government spent less than 2.5% of U.S. income. And then during the Obama administration, it's been up to over 25%. It's a little bit less than that now, but almost a quarter of our income. So, I mean, you look at that huge growth in government spending as a share of income in the United States, but also around the world. It's true around the world. Then you go back to the 19th century, and that was a century of essentially no government growth. And if you look at the United States, from about 1865 up until the turn of the century, government expenditures per person remained pretty constant. Even as the economy was growing, we were becoming wealthier and wealthier. So the federal government's share of the total economy was shrinking. So here, I mean, you have this shrinking government leading up to the 20th century, and then an explosion in government growth. So I was really interested in looking into that. But as I was doing so, every time I would look at something, it looked like something a little earlier might have had an influence, and then something a little earlier than that, something a little earlier than that. So the project really started as a study of government growth, and mostly growth in government expenditures. But then the topic expanded because I could see how much that change in ideology from liberty to democracy influenced the growth of government. And so I really started to look at those events, and the book took on more of a historical tone.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's how an economics professor gets involved in history and how that wraps to economics in the future. And I think the whole thing really ties together. And just listening to you and some of the other shows I've heard you on, the whole topic is fascinating. When we were just talking about the Civil War, and then from the Civil War as the veterans being a special interest group, and then going towards, you mentioned the progressive era. I think now, since from 1965 or 1865 and 70s going towards the 1900s, we're probably entering the progressive era. How did that affect people's perception of America as a democracy?
Well, I think you have several effects going on there. The one that I just mentioned was the growth of the veterans as an interest group. And so people could see that, and so it became apparent that you could use the government to your economic advantage. The veterans were doing it. And at the same time, as we said a little bit earlier, you have this big growth in concentrated economic power. So, when you look at those capitalists in that period, the Rockefellers, the Fisks, the Vanderbilts, Carnegie, and so forth, you see a big concentration of economic power, and so sort of seeing the direction that government is going, people who don't have so much concentrated economic power start looking to the government and thinking, hey, they ought to be protecting my economic well-being against these giant trusts who seem to be taking advantage of us. Then you had, for example, you look at the railroads, and you had farmers who were growing their grain. They were sending the grain elevators, shipping their grain away on the railroads. But the railroads had a lot of power because there are a lot of farmers in the area. They all had to go to the local railroad to ship their grain. And so it's, relatively straightforward for them to think, hey, the government needs to do something to protect me from being taken advantage of by these big firms. And so you get people starting to look at government more as an organization that should protect their economic well-being. And certainly the veterans were looking at the government that way. They were pretty opportunistic.
Yeah, it's funny. When you look at, well, you talked about they're called the so-called robber barons and such, but it appears to me that if you have wealth, you're not going to just put it in a hole in the ground and bury it and just keep your wealth. You're going to invest it in other places. You're going to hire more people. You're going to invest in production. So what was so wrong with acquiring wealth?
Well, I don't think it was the acquiring wealth, but people felt like that some of these big trusts were doing it in such a way that they were taking advantage of people who didn't have so much economic power. And this is a debate that, in a way, goes back to the founding of our country. That you had Alexander Hamilton was the Secretary of Treasury, and he viewed that the federal government ought to take more oversight over the economy. Meanwhile, Thomas Jefferson had a very limited government vision. That the government essentially should protect people's rights, and then it's hands off from there. And so there was this debate at the time about these Jeffersonian versus Hamiltonian ideas, and whether the government should take a bigger role like Hamilton said or a smaller role like Jefferson said. But by the time you move ahead 100 years, you move to the beginning of the 20th century, and people are saying, well, those Jeffersonian ideas seem to fit pretty well when we had a mostly agrarian economy, mostly rural country. But as the Industrial Revolution took off and the nature of our economy changed, that those Hamiltonian ideas seem to apply more to the modern economy. So ultimately, one way to look at that progressive era is the ideas of Hamilton won out over the ideas of Jefferson.
Yeah, right. And getting closer to the 19th century, or 1900s, if you look at Europe, of course, Marx and his writings have taken hold of Europe. The idea of more government, idea of a people's utopia. How did that play anything, you think, going into the progressive era? There's all the academic, seemed like the academics of era were actually traveling to Europe, and they're coming into the early 1900s. They're traveling to Europe, traveling to the Soviet Union, checking out the new form of government, and that perhaps was the future. That had to have some impact on America.
My conjecture is it probably had a minimal impact, that Marx's ideas never were hugely influential in the United States. And a lot of the problems that Marx saw, which I think were real problems. I mean, if you go back to the 1800s, Marx was not the only person who observed that you had these wealthy factory owners who were employing people who were barely earning enough to get by. I mean, that was essentially the conventional wisdom among economists through the 1800s. You had John Stuart Mill, who was, essentially saying the same thing, observing the same thing. Other economists, David Ricardo, and of course Thomas Robert Malthus is pretty well known for his ideas that population is always going to be stuck in poverty because population growth outstrips the availability of resources. So those ideas, that part of Marx was pretty commonly held at the time. But by the time you move into the 20th century, people's standards of living were going up, and they could see the improvement. And so I don't really see that Marx's ideas were that influential in the United States, and even maybe in most of Europe. I mean, of course, you always have those Marxist ideas, but if you look at where those ideas won out, I'm thinking partly won out by force, but you look at Russia turning into the Soviet Union, you look at Eastern Bloc countries. It wasn't the wealthy countries in Western Europe, it was the poor countries that took on that Marxist ideology. When you look around the world today, that still tends to be true. I mean, Marxist ideology is pretty big in Central America right now. So it seems to appeal more to countries that are poor and not growing than countries in Western Europe and the United States, countries that have a vibrant market economy.
It appears the poor, they probably just want a better life, looking for some, and it probably appeals to them, a worker's paradise, or there was at that. I'm sure it's very popular to criticize the wealthy and such, but I just heard the other day, I forgot what show it was on. It was a radio show. They said America produces 50% of the wealth in the world. If that's truly the case, think about what America went from. It went from an agricultural society, in the 1700s to what we are today. In fact, in the early 1800s, through the Industrial Revolution, prior to that, into the Industrial Revolution to the 1940s, America kind of was almost the China of today. We were the low-cost producer, but we were also a place where people, because of that liberty, people could come to and they could make themselves. They could make anything they wanted. In one generation, you could be on a steamer ship coming to America, and your children could be attending some of the finest universities in the world just because of the wealth that they could acquire here. So I'm thinking the wealth, yes, it did concentrate somewhat on the top, but it also seemed to affect everybody in America. This was the place to be. This is a land of liberty, personal liberty, and a land of actually to do it on your own, to make your wealth.
Well, I think that's right. That people have always looked at the United States as the land of opportunity. We've had a lot of economic mobility, and a lot of that is because we do have a very limited government, and we adhere pretty closely to rule of law. And what I mean by rule of law is everybody's treated the same under the law. And that
mostly today.
I think maybe
I'll just throw it in there. Sometimes if you look at the politics today, like you might be in trouble in the higher echelons of government, and now it seems sometimes the rule of law still works, but I think when that gets threatened, that's what America might have a little bit of an issue. But you're right. Ultimately, yeah, it's still a rule of law, not a rule of people.
And, I mean, if you don't have rule of law, and some people are privileged under the legal system, you have ambitious people, rather than looking for ways to produce goods that will entice consumers, you have those entrepreneurial individuals looking for ways that they can gain government favors and find themselves in the favored group, the inside group, the cronies, rather than the outsiders. And so that's detrimental to the entire society. I think maybe that's one reason why Marxism appeals to a lot of people in Central America, is they don't have rule of law the same way that we have in the United States, that we almost take for granted. And so they do tend to think, and maybe with some justification, that people who are the most prosperous, the most financially successful, are successful because of their connections and their political power, rather than because they're producing goods and services that other people want to consume.
You know, I spent 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan, and I saw that the Afghan people welcomed the Taliban at first because they were kind of tired of the cronyism. They're invaded by everybody. They had the Soviet Union in there. They had corruption. And what they just wanted, basically, someone to make things safer. And so they accepted the Taliban. And of course, the Taliban brought with him a lot of death and destruction, and some fanatical religious beliefs there that seem to really prevent their future. But I got to tell you, one thing I noticed when my tours there is that capitalism, the free markets, it's the only thing that sustained the Afghan people, you know, through dictators in the 20th century, the 19th century, and earlier. They used to be the crossroads of commerce. They know what commerce does. They know that it's almost, you could have gone almost anywhere in that country and you could buy anything you wanted. You could buy a TV set in some sand dune somewhere in that country out in the west over the by. I traveled those roads over there. It's like, and capitalism does provide a better living even in that country. And they brought in some totalitarian reign because they didn't have that rule of law, like you were saying. So that's definitely one of the things that America has going for it. So,
yeah, and a market economy promotes cooperation the way that government doesn't. I mean, a lot of times we talk about competition in markets and cooperation in government, but it's really just the opposite. That in government, you know, you can have people who agree on almost everything, but they disagree about some minor point. And instead of talking about the stuff that they broadly agree on, they'll be arguing about the stuff where they disagree. And the reason for that is with government, you pass a law, it's one law for everybody, one government policy for everybody. So it's natural that you would focus on the areas of disagreement so you could get what you want out of government. But in markets, when people transact in markets, they only interact over things where they agree. So, you know, if you want Coke, you get Coke. If you want Pepsi, you get Pepsi. You shop where you want. You buy goods that you want. And the only way that somebody can get your money in a market economy is if you voluntarily agree to give it. Unlike in government, where they'll tax it away from you whether you want what they're doing or not. And I mean, you know, think about it. When you go to a restaurant or when you go to a store, you know, before you buy something, do you ask the person, let me check about your political beliefs to make sure that we have the same political beliefs. Let me check about your religious beliefs to make sure we believe the same things. You know, I'm really strongly pro-life. I want to make sure before I buy anything that you're not one of these people who are in favor of abortion, or, you know, something like. No, it never even crosses your mind, right? That you can disagree with somebody about almost everything, and yet in a market economy, everybody gets along fine. You never even find out about areas where you might disagree. So a market economy really promotes cooperation and peaceful coexistence, and government promotes conflict and disagreement.
Yeah, I look at, you know, as we approach more democracy, there was the Soviet Union, there was the East Bloc, and it was funny because, like, East Germany, they were the democratic government of East Germany, something like that. They actually had democracy in their name. They were far from
People's
it.
Democratic Republic.
Right. They were far from it. And I look today in our government, you were comparing government with the free market. And the free market does provide those things. Nobody does ask those questions. But when you get into politics, and then if your politics affects so many people, like, say, the federal government. If they pass a law, it affects people in Florida to Oregon, the entire United States. It may not apply to people in Florida very well because it may not fit their way of life, but because it was done in Washington, D.C., now everybody has to live with it. And that federalism component, it seems to be kind of lost a little bit as you leave liberty and you approach democracy. Is there some valid points in that?
Sure. I mean, one of the big advantages that we have in the United States is there are 50 different states and 50 different state laws, and so you have a choice where you want to live, where you want to do business, and so forth. And we're losing that a little bit because the federal government has more and more power, so increasingly you don't have so much choice. And when people make the choice that they want to live under a different regime or move to a different government, governments are critical of that. I'm thinking in particular of the recent case of Burger King looking to move their headquarters from Miami into Canada. And why? Because tax rates are lower in Canada, but why shouldn't they look for the most advantageous place for them to do business? And why shouldn't we in the United States try to make our country the most advantageous place to do business rather than trying to penalize people and keep them here when they would be better off if they moved?
Right, the penalizing people for moving, that was kind of Cuba today, and it was the East Bloc countries in the past, and you have North Korea. I think truly the free markets and liberty go hand in hand. I don't think you can really have one without the other, at least efficiently or effectively.
Well, that was Milton Friedman's idea in Capitalism and Freedom. If you don't have capitalism, you're also going to lose your freedom.
Well, we've gone through the start of our country, from our founding fathers through the war between the states into the progressive era. Something just fell behind me. Into the progressive era, and then through the 40s and into today. Where are we today? And from, I guess, World War II going into today, where has liberty gone? Where has democracy gone? What do you think the future of America is today?
Yeah, I think we've made the complete transition to democracy. I mean, the idea of a limited government, even when we debate things like the Affordable Care Act and those sorts of things, we never think about the constitutional principles of limited government. It's always people want this, people don't want that. People who are in favor of the Affordable Care Act say people want this. People want this health care coverage. People who are against it say, no, people don't want it, it's not going to work. But nobody says, let's look at the Constitution and see whether the federal government has a constitutional power to do this. And I think, in a sense, the end of any constitutional constraint on the scope of federal government, I think that end came with the introduction of Social Security. As you go back, that was in 1936. There were three court cases in 1937 that determined the constitutionality of Social Security. But, you look at it, and if the Constitution is a list of enumerated powers of the federal government, and the 10th Amendment says powers not explicitly given to the federal government or go to the states or to the people, where in the Constitution does it say anything about the federal government's power to run a compulsory retirement system? It's just not there. So from Social Security onward, it seems like any constitutional constraint on government has been lost. But if you look at the big expansions of government before the 1960s, they tended to come in response to crises that the nation faced. So you look at, we talked about the big expansion of government powers during the war between the states. Well, but there was a big crisis there, and government stepped up and addressed the crisis, and afterwards it didn't shrink back, it had expanded powers. You see the same thing after World War I and World War II. You see the same thing in the New Deal during the Great Depression. Essentially what the government was doing there, even with Social Security and other programs, what the government was doing there was responding to a crisis situation. People are saying things are getting worse, the government needs to step in and do something. And so Prior to the 1960s, we tended to see these expansions of government in response to crises, in response to problems that people were perceiving. But then you move into the 1960s and Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs. And there we had expansions of government even though things were actually getting better. That we declared a war on poverty. We had all these poverty programs. But if you look at the poverty rate in the United States since World War II, right up until the end of the 1960s, it was declining at a pretty good clip. That we were really cutting poverty, even as we declared a war on poverty. So there was no crisis there, but it was just people liked the idea of a war on poverty. The same thing with Medicare and Medicaid. Both of those programs were introduced in 1966. But health care in the United States was improving at that time. Medicare and Medicaid weren't introduced in order to solve some health care problem that we had. No, I mean, the health care system was getting better. Health outcomes were getting better. But, you know, there was democratic pressure to do that. And so I would call Lyndon Johnson's Great Society the ultimate triumph of democracy, because there, those Great Society programs ended up being passed not because there was a specific problem government was trying to address, but rather because most people wanted them. You know, this was popular appeal. So as we move into the 21st century, I mean, that's what we see from government is, you know, what do most people want? You know, let's look at what a majority of the population wants, and the role of government is to carry out the will of the majority. So it's really, that's the democracy has ultimately triumphed over liberty as the fundamental principle of American government.
Yeah, I think that's the case for sure. It seems to follow I'm going to butcher this, there's some sort of cycle of republics out there. It's about a 200-year cycle where people go through, they don't have liberty, they gain liberty, and they move through it through democracy, and then the hand of government gets more intrusive in their lives, and they eventually lose the republic. I don't know if that's the case for America. Let's hope it's not. And I think I love the quote from Winston Churchill. He said that Americans always do the right thing once they tried everything else. So I'm sure we'll always do the right thing. Well, Dr. Holcombe, thank you for spending the last 50 minutes or so of your day with us. And I know I've learned a lot today, and it truly was an interesting show. If people need to get a hold of you, or if they want to read a little bit more about you, or do you have any events coming up that you want to advertise?
Well, I don't have any big events coming up. From time to time I'll speak here and there. But if they're interested in getting a hold of me, I do have a website, randallholcombe.com, if you can figure out how to spell my name, RANDALLHOLCOMBE. But if you can't find that or you can't remember, I am on the faculty at Florida State University in the economics department. So if you go to the Florida State University website, you go to economics department, that you'll be able to find me and a link to my website there at Florida State University.
And you're a prolific writer. If you look in Amazon and a few other places, just do a web search, you can sure find your books out there. It was definitely a fascinating show today. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks for having me on, Reggie. I enjoyed our conversation.